Jung H. Pak is a former Korea analyst at the CIA and now a foreign policy senior fellow at the Center for East Asia Policy Studies for the Brookings Institution. She joins me now. Jung, I really enjoyed reading your Brookings essay looking at Kim Jong-un. In it, you write that the CIA calls North Korea the hardest of the hard targets. Why do you think it is that intelligence analysis is so hard and that it isn't intuitive, as you mentioned?
Hi, thank you for having me. It's my pleasure to be with you today. We call North Korea the hardest of the hard targets because the regime is so opaque, where some of the most basic information about the regime and its leaders are not known to the public, and it's really difficult to try to understand the regimes. Not as much as we can see its capabilities and its demonstrations of its missiles and its nuclear tests. For example, yesterday they had their big military parade, but it's really hard to gather intentions, most of all. That is, what is the leadership is trying to do with its nuclear weapons program in particular? You
say intentions are really hard to understand. What do you think the biggest misconception is about Kim Jong-un?
I think there's a lot of discussion on whether he's rational. And I argue, and I have been arguing, that Kim is a rational actor who is not this erratic madman who's out to kill millions of Americans. That's not the case at all. But in the past six plus years that he's been North Korea's leader, he's gone up to the brink, and yet he knows when to dial back. And I see this Olympic outreach as part of his maneuvering to dial back and lower tension on the Korean Peninsula.
You know, we talk about just how leading up to the Olympics at this point, where he's managed to really put North Korea on the map here, getting attention. He's sending his sister now to the games in South Korea. What do you make of that and sports diplomacy?
The fact that he's sending his sister Kim Yo-jong to South Korea, I think, is a pretty big deal. Kim himself, as far as we know, has not left the country. So we have his sister, his flesh and blood, his full sister, coming to South Korea to meet with President Moon of South Korea. So I think it's a big deal. I think it's a way of upping the ante in terms of, Vice President Pence will be going there with the father of Otto Warmbier, the 20-year-old student who died as a result of being in North Korea's custody. The fact that his sister is going, I think, is yet another part of his charm offensive to try to lure South Korea away from the U.S. and the maximum pressure campaign.
I want to play a bite for you, Jung. Yesterday at the White House press briefing, Defense Secretary James Mattis was asked, are we headed to war with North Korea? Here's what he had to say.
The situation with Korea, it is firmly in the diplomatic lane. We have seen much stronger diplomatic action. For example, the last three United Nations Security Council resolutions, unanimous. And how often do you see France and Russia, PRC, China, and the United States, Great Britain, all voting, and other countries all voting unanimously? I think that makes it very clear this is firmly in the diplomatic lane, and we, of course, back up Secretary of State Tillerson's foreign policy efforts as guided by the president with viable military options.
Firmly in the diplomatic lane. Jung, what do you make of that? Do you think that anything will come from potential diplomacy?
We have been in the diplomatic lane, and we're firmly in the diplomatic lane, but I don't think they can deny, the Trump administration can deny that there are discussions about military options. Several senior officials have been talking about military options and our willingness to use them, in part to bolster the diplomacy efforts over the past several months. So I think what's clear to me is that military options are still on the table, and that various discussions are in place to figure out what the next steps are on North Korea.
When you look about a potential bloody nose type strike, if the U.S. were to ever launch anything directly on North Korea, do you think that Kim Jong-un would hesitate to use nuclear weapons?
I think the assumption behind the bloody nose concept is that somehow Kim Jong-un and the North Korea's leadership will not respond to a limited strike effort on North Korea. But I think we have to remember this is not North Korea of 10 years ago or 15 years ago, but this is a North Korea with a leader who is willing to use chemical nerve agents. For example, He was probably responsible for the murder of his half-brother Kim Jong-nam in Malaysia. And North Korea possesses vast amounts of chemical weapons that they can use. It has a variety of nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles to deliver them. So the North Koreans have a variety of options to respond to any kind of military strike, bloody nose or not. It's going to be bloody for lots of people.
Yeah, no, it's not an option anybody wants to see. I want to ask you about Kim Jong-un. You'd mentioned earlier sort of this dual image of him. You've got him pictured as a short, fat, crazy, and experienced boy on one portrayal. And then there's also this 10-foot tall guy, as you mentioned, a giant with untold and unlimited potential, nuclear capabilities and cyber capabilities. Which one is he?
Right. I think ever since he came to power when he was 20-something years old in 2011, after the death of his father, it was easy to make fun of the way he looked and to caricature the North Korean leader as this big fat baby. And our own president and others have called him names over the past several years. But I think we tend, in inflating his infantileness or inflating his capabilities, I think skews our policy discussions about what he's capable of. So if we see him as this giant, this 10-foot tall giant, we think of him as undeterrable, omnipotent, and unstoppable. But if we see him as a baby, then this is somebody who needs to be stopped, who's irrational, who's liable to hurt himself and others. So I think these overlapping perceptions, misperceptions of Kim Jong-un really do damage to our way of really understanding and figuring out policy responses.
Jung H. Pak, thank you very much for joining us, Jung.
Thank you so much.